You're listening to Brood Parasites, Chapter 2. Written by Michael Gray. As read by Ken Craig. The clock's tick filled the room. It had been insubstantial when they arrived, but now expanded to fit the silence between the two men facing each other across the table. Benjamin Sandon watched Captain Partridge. The look was returned, and the guardsman drummed his fingers on the teak tabletop without shifting his eyes. Sandon recognized the gesture for what it was, and resisted the urge to look down at the man's hand. It was an unfamiliar sensation for Sandon, a man lucky enough to have found at least one redeeming feature in every person he met, that within a minute of meeting the captain of the Royal Guard, he knew he had made the acquaintance of someone whom he would enjoy loathing. He assumed Partridge shared the feeling, and this staring match was nothing more than a chance to gain a small victory. The clock ticked on. Sandon became aware of another sound. Sleet spattered the windows with sharp insistence. He told himself he knew what he would see outside. The same weather he walked through from the carriage into the Parliament's Clockhouse building, the dull roofscape of Dunholm, edges highlighted with rain, and an expanse of slate-grey cloud spreading out in every direction as if God himself was pressing down on the kingdom. The clock talked. He felt a blink creep from behind his eyes and suppressed the urge. The clock ticked. The fingers drummed. The sleet hit the windows. The clock. The sleet, the fingers, Partridge's eyes, the clock, the lock. The lock sounded and the door handle twisted. Before he could stop himself, his eyes shifted to the door, moving back too late, but in time to see the quick smile on Partridge's lips. The guard captain stood, Sandon a beat after, and turned to the door. Lord Downing walked in, his red face and heavy breath perfectly in tune with his short, round stature. He sweated from beneath a powdered wig 30 years out of fashion, but seemed too distracted to notice. Behind him followed a pale young man carrying a stack of folders half the length of his torso and bound in red tape. Behind came a slab of a man, perhaps as old as Lord Downing, but one who had not allowed age to interfere with a body which filled his military brocade jacket to every corner. The last man immediately noted the two men already in the room, saving most of his attention for Partridge. But Lord Downing made it to the head of the long table, dropping the single file he carried before he noticed Sandon and Partridge.
"Ah, gentlemen, good."
He opened the file and began flicking through the pages.
"Only two of you still,"
he said without looking up.
"I did not know there would be anyone else, your lordship," said Sandon.
Yes, apologies and so forth,"
said Downing with a wave.
"All this is happening much too quickly for my taste. But still, yes, introductions."
He looked at the man who came in with him, and with a tilt of his eyebrows indicated Sandon and Partridge.
"General, meet Mr. Benjamin Sandon, and perhaps you already know Captain Partridge. Benjamin, Captain, this is Field General Salter, commander of His Majesty's earthbound armies."
"We've met," said General Salter to the room, but not looking at Partridge. Only Downing seemed oblivious to the animosity. Sandon let the moment drag until it became clear he would not be addressed, then held out his hand.
"An honor, General."
Salter turned to Sandon and took his hand after flicking a look back at Partridge. "An honor returned, Mr. Sandon." The handshake rattled Sandon's elbow.
"If it is not too bold of me, General, I am humbled to be in the presence of such a hero of the king. I grew up reading of your victories in the news sheets, and never thought one day I would be in the presence of such a person as yourself. Surely there are few men who had done as you have in the name of so many."
"Well, perhaps if I were you, Mr. Sandon, I would hold on to that thought until my colleague arrives."
There was a look in the man's eye and a slight raise to the edges of his mustache. Sandon wondered at what he could mean, when the door opened again. In walked a man whose likeness was known to every man, woman, and child in the kingdom, especially among young boys whose thoughts of war and adventure intermingled until they were interchangeable. Admiral Ian Kilpatrick, Sea Lord to the Kingdom of the Isles and Lord Protector of the King and his family, was insultingly normal to look upon in person. But the room shrank before him and his reputation, as if making way for history. He took in the room, offering short nods to Salter and Partridge, and also to Sandon, who felt his throat go dry. The Admiral wore a plain uniform, black instead of the usual navy yellow, and wore no medals nor sign of rank. He reached an empty chair before Lord Downing realized he had even arrived.
Admiral, welcome. Thank you for making the time. I appreciate how busy you are.
How busy we all are, Lord Downing, Kilpatrick said in a gentle voice.
Absolutely. Well, with that in mind, perhaps we should begin. Jeremy, give us the room, please.
The young man placed the pile of folders on the table and left without a word, while Downing waved everyone to sit.
I'll be as brief as possible, gentlemen. This could not have come at a worse time. Not a worse time at all. I am as unprepared for this role as you are for having someone new in it. Wherever Lord Godalming has gone, I hope he is safe, obviously, but it has left the Ministry of the Interior in utter chaos.
Nettle, probably, said Partridge, pushing himself comfortably into his seat. That's where his mistress was from.
An honourable man does not leave his duty for a mistress,
said Salter. He did not turn to Partridge as he spoke. Partridge shrugged as if it were no matter.
Either way,
said Downing, wedging his words between the two men,
I need to fully understand our situation, especially now. So please, as if I were a layman from the streets, tell me everything.
He pulled a long rolled cloth from beneath the ribbon holding the stack of files together and unrolled it across the table until a map of Europa lay between them all. It was designed with politics rather than geography in mind, and an effort had been made when it was drawn to use the colors of each nation to shade in the areas of their rule without having to search between every town name and river valley. A hopeful thought on the part of the cartographer. Since then, the borders between countries had been scrubbed and shaded in an effort to keep up with the constant movement of national boundaries. Dates had been scrawled in ink and then crossed out as territory was gained and lost, until the separations looked like mountainous areas across the map, raising from the fabric and giving a third dimension to the image. And then there was the contentious issue of the color of the country crouched in the map's center. It seemed as if the rich blue had been scrubbed pale to represent the loss of its royal house. Or perhaps it had just faded, and it was only that the map had outlived one of the ancient families of Europa. Or another of them, Sandon thought. He looked over other, smaller territories radiating outward from the blue. If it were truly representative, they would also have had their royal colors erased and replaced with the same powder blue of their new neighbor. Perhaps the clerks did not think to do that. Or perhaps they could not keep up with the armies marching across old frontiers. Kilpatrick leaned forward and with an index finger began tracing over the map. We know of 3 separate Gallian armies marching northwest and west. We initially hoped they would have stopped at Batavia to take the natural harbours there, but that was back when credence to their call for a crusade of republics was little in evidence. Since then, Lower Elgay and the principalities of Freunst and Minnedenst have fallen. Another has surrounded Mittlerburg. This is in spite of the burgomaster of Mittlerburg buying peace with 2 earth movers last year. We can only assume Mittlerburg will fall, and that will mark the last of the Britannian city-states. Of the other, we are not certain where it is. It turned inland away from the Girding Sea, and we could not track it. Downing rested his chin on steepled fingers and stared at the map as Kilpatrick spoke.
I see. And what of the inner sea?
Kilpatrick leant further over to the map's center.
A little better news. We still have control of the water, but friendly ports in the north are becoming hard to find. Most of the Gallian forces moved east, but some are gathering in their south near the Tilian Gap. and the ports along the Aipus coast are becoming less willing to allow our ships to the dock for fear of Gallian reprisal should their armies move on them.
Will they?
Said Downing. Almost certainly. Kilpatrick leant back. If they have proved anything in this war of theirs, it is that they will not stand their largest neighbour to remain a monarchy. Pardon my ignorance, but I do not understand. If they have 3 armies large enough to move with impunity across the north, how can they have enough men left to move on the south? Sandon said.
The Gallians have armies like nothing that have been put into the field before, Mr. Sandon,
said General Salter, making Mr. sound like a rank.
Their cause attracts the common man. There is not a peasant in all of the mainland that has not been mistreated at some point by their landowners or cheated by the church. Gallia promises freedom from bonds to the land, the chance to earn their own money, and not least of all, revenge. They may not put the largest armies ever into the field, but each man is there willingly, and they have something to fight for. I would put any Isles man against one of theirs any day, and would expect us to win. But after that Gallian falls, there is another behind him, and another behind that one. With every city that falls to them, their numbers swell, not shrink as they have done in every campaign in the past. The poor flock to them, and most professional soldiers can see how it would go, and will swap sides.
The way Salter said it, the earnest words in such a big man, made it seem immediate and threatening, and a world away from the trouble on the continent parlor talk he grew up hearing. His natural curiosity won over the embarrassment of ignorance, and he carried on. Then if they are so formidable, why have they not attacked the Isles? While we may not be as large a country as Aipus, surely we represent the larger threat. Salter raised an eyebrow at Lord Downing.
He is to be my secretary, General, and Benjamin is intelligent and a quick study. Please treat him as you would me. Very well, he said, and turned back to Sandon. The main reason is the sea. The Wash has some very strong currents, and it takes a ship captain with a lifetime of experience to know and read its tides. I doubt there are enough such captains in Gallia to bring across an invasion force, let alone enough willing to take the commission. Secondly, we rule those waves, and all from the Isles to the ice sheets in the north and the south, all the way to Bernab and across the eastern to the provinces. Gallia has almost always satisfied itself with its land-based conquests in Europa, leaving the sailors of the Isles to ply the seas and increase their skills and pass those skills on to the next generation.
Sandon heard the tone in Salter's words which left something unsaid. But you do not believe that state of affairs will continue? Salter once more looked at Downing.
I would ask that myself if Benjamin hadn't. No, my lord, I don't think they will.
Captain Partridge scoffed, and Salter's expression darkened, but Admiral Kilpatrick spoke first. The Gaulish have already moved down the eastern Argan Neck. The free cities there have fallen without any fight to talk of, and most offered birth to our navy. Not any more. The third army I mentioned has me concerned. It could have moved anywhere. The greatest concern I have is they begin to encircle the Middle Sea. The sea is huge, and the loss of even a few ports makes it harder at each step to cover entire sections. And already the Gaulish have put vessels into the water off the Argon. They're testing their skill, and while I agree with the General's assessment that any Islesman could match a Gallian skill for skill and then a great deal more, they have the numbers. And if they continue this way, they will soon have the resources to throw vessel after vessel into the water until they learn how to stop sinking. Sandon looked down at the map and at the sea soaking up its center. The lands around represented the offspring of the oldest civilizations. The poets in Gyptus were composing plays which would still be studied for their meanings 2,000 years later. They were warm, wet, productive, and, most importantly, settled. They produced the goods and the commodities both needed and sought in North and East Europa. And then, of course, there was the cradle. If it is the brief situation you want, my lord, then stretched is how I would put it, Kilpatrick continued. They're taking up an increasing amount of waterfront,
and their incursions onto the sea are growing proportionally. It would be foolhardy in the extreme to allow them to move without at least monitoring them. But we are just one nation, and as friendly ports dry up, so do the merchants based in them.
I see, said Downing.
He looked at the map before saying,
And what word from the cradle?
Nothing, as you might expect,
said Salter.
His omnipotence does not side with single nations and all that.
But what of the Third Army? Said Sandon. His eyes had traced the movements Kilpatrick and Salter had listed on the map, and in mind's eye drew a direct line across it. Could they be moving towards the cradle? Partridge scoffed again, and this time Salter seemed to agree.
No country would move on the cradle, lad,
said Salter.
Every other country in Europa would turn on them, and that's before the priests unleash their own forces. No, lad, the church is safe. Don't worry about that.
Embarrassed, Sandon stopped speaking.
And that's how we sit at the moment, said Downing.
In broad strokes, my lord, yes,
said Salter.
I have left a more detailed report in writing with your office, and another copy with the Admiral. I'm sure Ian will find nothing is amiss.
Kilpatrick nodded in agreement.
Very well. What are the immediate threats?
Kilpatrick said, To the Isles. Nothing immediate. The Gaulish are doing what any prudent enemy would, and are keeping our navy busy on spot and chase games without actually engaging us. There are always minor insurrections and attacks from locals in the colonies and Brunab, but that is not worth noting here.
Good, good. Well, gentlemen, I want you to know I shall always be available if anything occurs where the Lord Chancellor or His Majesty should be made aware of. You're not the type of men who would think twice to do anything necessary, I know, but I like to make things clear.
I appreciate the clarity, my lord. So, in that spirit, what is he doing here?
Said Salter, and pointed at Partridge. The captain of the Royal Guard had spread out comfortably in the chair until he had filled it. One side of his mouth rose in a half-smile.
Captain Partridge has been charged with my well-being for the foreseeable future.
Sandon looked around at Partridge. While clearly fit and healthy, the man looked no older than himself. The stark whites and blues of the Royal Guard uniform added an air of authority, but his face was as fresh and unscarred as Sandon's own. More than that, with minimal words, Partridge had proved himself to have the petulant character of a child in an adult's body, an aspect strengthened with the way he smiled at the looks on Salter and Kilpatrick's faces at Lord Downing's news. Partridge turned the smile on Sandon, as if to share the good news with him, or just spread his conceit.
Are you in any danger?
Said Sandon. Downing answered that with another wave.
I'm fine. I'm sure wherever he is, Lord Godalming is healthy and well.
But we don't know,
said Sandon, turning the statement into a question.
No, we don't,
conceded Downing.
He would not be the first minister to abscond from his duties, nor, I dare say, will he be the last. But on the chance it is something more malign, the Lord Chancellor saw fit to ask His Majesty to extend the captain's responsibility to include myself for the time being.
Nothing untoward shall happen to you while I draw breath, my lord, said Partridge, inclining his head in a shallow bow.
I'm sure,
said Downing. He began to shuffle papers into short piles.
Now, I know how busy we all are. I believe that concludes everything for now. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. That will be all. Do forgive me if I don't see you out.
Kilpatrick and Salter stood and offered a salute before leaving together. Their voices intermingled in the beginning of a conversation before the door closed behind them. Captain Partridge took a little more time, checking his saber and pistol before giving his own, less formal salute and leaving. When the door had closed, Sandon began to push himself up also.
Stay there for a moment, would you, Benjamin?
Downing's voice was softer than before, and exhaustion could be heard behind the words. Sandon settled himself back down and waited for Downing to speak. The new Minister for the Interior finished moving around the papers before him and cast his eyes over them without looking. He held the position for a moment before taking off his spectacles and rubbing his eyes.
Aunt Emma won't be pleased if she hears how much you've been working,
he said.
Aunt Emma is never pleased,
said Downing. He sighed, put the paper down, and fell into a thought that had nothing to do with his paperwork. Sandon saw how his uncle had aged in the weeks since the letter arrived at his estate. Never the healthiest of men, Geoffrey Downing's usual ruddiness had given way to a clammy cream which dominated all his face except for beneath his eyes. Sandon hoped he would be able to alleviate some of the stress he was obviously feeling.
Do you believe there's any real danger? I mean, Captain Partridge does not seem the... well,
capable sort,
Downing said with a smile.
I was going to say military.
I understand your concern, but the Lord Chancellor was most adamant on the point. And the captain guards His Majesty, and I cannot imagine the position going to someone who only looks dashing beneath a plumed helmet.
If you're satisfied, my lord.
Downing smiled again.
Please, lad, not that when we're alone. I'm satisfied that the Chancellor is satisfied. I've not had much chance to think on it at the moment.
He looked about the papers around him and the map spread across the table, and said as much to himself as to Sandon.
So much to do, so much to know.
The General and the Admiral seemed confident,
he said.
Benjamin, Benjamin, I sometimes forget your mother never allowed you into the military.
Sandon closed his mouth and forced down the warmth he felt reddening his cheeks.
Something you should know about old war horses like Admiral Kilpatrick and General Salter is that they do not think down the same lines as you or I. There is a war coming, Benjamin, undoubtedly. All that is keeping us from speaking Gaulish is they have yet to figure a way over the Wash, and men like Salter and Kilpatrick, they look forward to them trying.